there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken. One man, one microphone, one mission, one message. True News, the only newscast reporting the countdown to the second coming of Jesus Christ. And now for the most powerful hour on radio, here is End Time Newsman, Rick Wiles.
This is True News, 1 hour of uncensored news, views, and commentary. Welcome to the program. I'm Rick Wiles. A major winter storm with heavy snow and ice blasted across much of the USA today, from Kansas to Maine. An estimated 100 million Americans in 24 states have been affected. Many places have reported over a foot of snow that has fallen so far today. Travel delays and disruptions have stranded travelers throughout the nation as over 1,700 flights were canceled, 4,000 flights delayed. The storm comes on the heels of Monday's wintry weather. More snow and ice is on the way this weekend. AccuWeather.com reported today that it is monitoring another snowstorm that will travel over the Rockies on Saturday, reach the Central Plains states on Sunday, and move towards the eastern United States on Monday. AccuWeather is warning that this upcoming storm could be the most intense and disruptive storm of the 2013-2014 winter season. New York City, Washington, Philadelphia, and Boston may experience heavy snowfall this weekend. This is the winter of the polar vortex, and I am grateful to be living in Florida, where we are enduring a solar vortex. And I thought this would be a good time. To check in with former NASA Space Shuttle engineer John Casey for an update on planet Earth's rollover into a little ice age climate cycle. Mr. Casey is the president of the Space and Science Research Corporation in Orlando, Florida. The group is the primary advocate for global preparedness for a new cycle of cold climate. Mr. Casey is also a former space program advisor to the White House. He is the author of the book Cold Sun. John Casey, welcome back to True News.
Glad to be back, Rick. Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. You know, this is the first time in my life I ever heard the term polar vortex. I don't recall ever hearing that in the past in weather reports. Was the term polar vortex accurate, or was the media spinning things?
A double play on words, yes. They were spinning the vortex. Certainly the term polar vortex has been around quite some time, many years. The phenomena merely refers to the fact that there is a rotational motion of the atmosphere around the North Pole, in this case, the Arctic, and sometimes a portion will break off and force its way south, causing cold fronts to enter North America in this case, and give us the kind of winter weather we've been seeing this year. So nothing new. I think the fact that some media outlets picked up on the term and ran with it, playing it as if it were something new, is the only matter here. But
well, they also tried. They did their best to tell us that the Arctic cold blast was caused by global warming.
Yes, still a remarkable feature of the current administration and many in the mainstream media to spin any weather effect as global warming caused. We even had the president's science advisor actually tell people that the record cold that we were receiving this winter was caused by warming. Of course, those of us who follow science and practice science don't typically agree with the president's science advisor, certainly not on this.
When I hear people like this on the media or in the government talking, I just imagine they're wearing clown costumes. I'm like, I can't take you seriously anymore. Anything that comes out of your mouth is stupid. Let's talk about facts. What's happening on the sun? You wrote the book Cold Sun. That's a term that a lot of people are wondering. What do you mean, a cold sun? Before we talk about why you are referring to the sun as going cold, tell us, what is the current state of the sun right now? Are the sunspots still decreasing, as we were told earlier, or back in 2013?
Yes, they are, Rick. The current 11-year solar cycle is one of the weakest in over 100 years. That means that even though we're now exiting the peak of the 11-year cycle, where we should see quite a bit of solar activity, solar flares, and so forth, we're just not seeing them. In fact, we're seeing them at less than half of what we did the last cycle, which was predicted by me back in 06 and in 07. I contacted NASA's top solar physicist back then and told him that NASA's estimate for sunspots would be in error by 100%. Of course, they didn't agree with me back then, but now that's exactly what's happened. We do have a very weak solar cycle, and the next two 11-year cycles will be possibly the weakest in 400 years.
There was also a strange occurrence on the sun when the magnetic field, the poles did not flip as normal. Was it the North Pole flipped over to the South Pole, and for a long period of time the sun had two southern poles?
That's correct, but that didn't last that long. In fact, the complete cycle switch of poles did take place, and we're back to the normal process. The poles do flip, magnetically speaking, during the peak of these 11-year cycles, and that did occur. But for a period of time, we only had, we did have the blank North Pole and the two southern poles.
Was that unusual?
But not that unusual.
Okay.
But, so I wasn't concerned. Those of us who study the sun weren't that concerned. The big concern we have is for the dramatic reduction in energy output by the sun that was predicted by me and others for the current cycle, and by many people now for the next two cycles. That's the big concern, because as the sun reduces its energy output by which it warms the Earth, that leaves us relatively much colder than we were before. And that's the big threat we all face here on planet Earth, is 30 or more years longer of record cold weather, which gets back to your first comment about this current winter. Even though we're seeing 100-year temperature records broken in many areas now, this is but the tip of the iceberg. Sorry for the pun. Mm-hmm. It's going to get much colder, bottom line.
You're saying that the sun literally is becoming colder, that it's like the thermostat of the sun has been adjusted, and the temperature of the sun is actually going down.
Yes, correct. The temperature in terms of the energy output, the heat energy output of the sun, is dropping. We see that by every measurement we make on the sun, including the sun's magnetic field, the 10.7 centimeter radio signal, the number and intensity of sunspots, the solar wind. By every measure that we take of the sun, it's going into what I call solar hibernation. This is an event every 206 years. It's a natural cycle of the sun. It's the reason we had 200 years of warming, and it's the reason we're now done with that, and we're heading into a 30-year or longer cold period.
So it is cyclical. This has happened before in the history of the planet.
Routinely, every 206 years for the last 1,200 years, with great accuracy, a little less before that. But this is a very dominant cycle in the Earth's climate variation. It is the most powerful cycle in the family of cycles I discovered and announced back in 2007, what I call my relational cycle theory of climate change. Basically, these are not the big, large ice age cycles, but the smaller ones that enable us to relate to or experience actual climate variation during one or two human lifetimes. The relational cycle theory that I formulated was sufficient for me to make a number of major climate change predictions back in '07, all of which have now come to pass.
You started making predictions in 2007 that we were going to see climate change appearing at approximately this time?
That's correct. The cycle was so predictable that even without checking to see if anyone else had discovered it, I issued my first press release in '07, notified the White House, the mainstream media, that within 3 years global warming would end, that the Earth's atmospheric temperatures would drop, that the ocean temperatures would drop, that the sun would go into a deep cycle of hibernation beginning in cycle number 24, the one we're in now, and that a new cold climate era would begin. I later, in 2010, predicted we would see record earthquakes and volcanoes during that same period. All of these predictions have now come to pass.
So what have your thoughts been throughout the winter of 2013, 2014, as you've seen these very strong, powerful winter storms go across North America and in Europe?
Well, once again, it's representative of how reliable these solar cycles are in climate prediction. Because we're seeing 100-year records being broken, that means we have to go back 100 years in the sunspot curve and see if there was a solar minimum back then, and sure enough, there was. That's a 90 to 100-year cycle that I also discovered during that research period in '07 and announced as part of the relational cycle theory. So it's fully expected and fully predictable that we're now going through the breaking of 100-year planetary cold temperatures, and we're on our way even colder, and by the late 2020s and 2030s, we'll be breaking 200-year cold weather records routinely.
If this cycle is 206 years long, then if we look back in history, if we go back 412 years and then go forward into the 1800s, what was happening on the planet? What was life like?
Well, it was certainly a very different world altogether. If you go back 2 cycles before, that would be the period of time called the Maunder minimum. It was one of the most devastatingly cold periods in recorded human history.
What years would that have been?
That would be 1615 to 1745. And during that period of time, the London Thames River froze over, the Mississippi routinely froze over, the Baltic Sea froze over to the extent that hotels and stores and roadways were built over the frozen ice so people could go between countries. It was clearly a very, very cold era. The next one that followed was from 1793 to 1830. That's the so-called Dalton minimum. And it was the very next cycle, another 206 years away. And at that point, here in the United States, we were a very young country. There were only 5 million American citizens at that time, not including Native Americans. And even then, we had a very difficult time. The cold was so bad that many citizens in New England froze to death and starved to death because of the cold and loss of crops during that period.
I read historical accounts that there was ice on the Everglades here in Florida.
Not at all a surprise. In fact, as we look at the options available, there are only 2 climate scenarios that we predict. One is another repeat of the Dalton minimum, the last 206-year event. But many scientists, especially our colleagues in Russia, are now saying it will be as bad as the Maunder minimum back in the 16 and 1700s.
When will there be enough?
We'll see lots of snow in Florida.
if it's a Maunder minimum.
Right.
When will there be enough scientific evidence to make a determination whether it's going to be a Dalton or a Maunder minimum?
We'll know that fairly soon, actually. There are ways of predicting a peak of cycle during the initial start. So what does that mean? Well, it means now that we're just passing the peak of the cycle 24, we've got about 5 or 6 years to bottom out. We'll stay low. So in 8 or 9 years, we should be able to fully predict cycle 25's peak. If cycle 25 peaks at 50 sunspots, then it's a Dalton minimum. If there are no sunspots effectively, then it will be another Maunder minimum.
What's the likelihood? What's the likelihood that we're going to miss both of them?
And do what? Get warmer?
Yeah.
Get more sunspots? Get less sunspots?
Yes.
Not very likely. If you look at these relational cycles that I discovered and announced, they're over 90% accurate. If you look at the work our Russian colleagues are doing, they're at least that accurate. That compares with the global warming and the greenhouse gas theory and the global warming based on CO2, which has been an utter failure in predicting climate variation. I wouldn't even hesitate to give it a percentage. I have yet to see a major climate prediction made by the global warming community that actually happened. So you're talking about a warming theory that has no real success versus natural solar cycles that are highly reliable.
If we're looking at it's a choice between a Dalton minimum or a Maunder minimum. If Dalton is the best case scenario and Maunder is the worst case scenario, take a few minutes and tell us. I know you already touched a little bit on what happened with the Maunder minimum, but if it's a Dalton minimum, how long will this cooling period last, and how cold will it get, and what kind of disruptions would it cause? This is best case.
Best case is the Dalton minimum compared to the Maunder, and in which case we're looking at 2 cycles, number 25 and number 6, having a peak sunspot count around 50. This would result in an average 5 to 10 degree average temperature drop across most crop growing zones in the U.S. Also during this same period, we would see sustained longer and deeper, colder winter periods that would infringe on the harvests in fall and make it very difficult to plant during the springtime. In addition to the temperature variation, we also know, for whatever reason, which we don't quite understand, that there's a very high correlation between these cold eras and major volcanic eruptions, as happened the last time when we had Mount Tambora explode in 1815. Mount Tambora was 100 times larger than Mount St. Helens. That'll give you an idea. And when you have magnitude volcanic explosions that powerful, you have a tremendous amount of dust and aerosols put into the atmosphere that block what little sunlight we're getting during those cold eras, and it makes it even colder. So that's the most optimistic. And what does that do for the crops during a typical Dalton minimum? Well, we should be prepared for regular losses of crops 10, 20, 30%. And in some years, I believe in the late 20s and early 2030s, we could see a complete loss of crops during some of those years.
And you're telling us that this is the best case. This is the best case scenario.
This is the best case scenario, yes, sir.
And we may have some years in the 20s and 30s that we have 100% loss of crops.
Under the best case scenario.
Okay. So with what will be the coldest years of the Dalton? Would that be 2030?
The cycle will not vary that much in duration, but it would in depth if we went to a Maunder minimum. That's the worst case scenario, in which case you go to effectively no sunspots during cycle 25, which is coming up, and cycle 26, you'll see the worst ever recorded temperatures in human history. You'll see massive death and starvation and social disruption on a global scale. Even during the most optimistic case, there may be a few years where the U.S. and Canadian leaders will have to simply announce they can't ship food overseas because we won't have enough for our own people. These events intensify during a Maunder minimum, when you have more damage, much colder era, and we should be prepared for the Mississippi to be frozen over much longer. New York Harbor in a Maunder minimum will be frozen over. You can walk between Staten and Manhattan without having to get a boat. It'll be frozen over solid for so long. The Philadelphia River will be frozen over for quite some time. And again, back in England, you'll see the Thames frozen over. Much of the Baltic coastlines will be frozen over. So it'll be a catastrophic climate event if we do have a Maunder minimum.
And is this across the board as far as the Northern Hemisphere?
Yes, it is. And in fact, the Southern Hemisphere is already cooling at such a rate that it pretty much is pointing the way that things are headed. And given that the oceans have been cooling for over 10 years now, almost 11 years, once the oceans start to cool, you cannot stop that cycle. It automatically transitions into a long-term, decades-long global cooling event, and that's already begun. Now, you don't read that on the papers, you don't see it on the news, and of course no one in the Obama administration's telling anyone the truth about what's happening with the oceans.
What are you privately advising people who are smart enough to listen to you and take this seriously? What are you privately advising them?
Well, at the end of my normal presentations, I routinely have people that ask that question. We believe what you're saying, but what do we do about it? There are several basic steps that I recommend. Number one is get educated, understand everything you can about this solar hibernation phenomena, study what happened during the last time during the 1800s here in the U.S., or in Europe. Study the Dalton minimum, the Maunder minimum. You can go online and Google search those names and read all about them. The second thing is recognizing that what's typically the worst problem is the food shortage. Mandatorily tells us that we need to make sure that we all have enough food on hand. We must have, and I recommend to everyone, at least a one-year food supply. At least a one-year food supply. And longer if you can do so. And by the way, that makes financial sense given the rate of increase in foodstuffs. If you buy a one-year food supply now, or build one up over time, you're going to be saving money downstream. So it's a good financial reason, if nothing else.
Okay, but if this lasts for decades, and you have one winter, that you have the year without a summer, and it's winter all along through the whole year, and there's massive starvation, and you eat through your 1 year food supply, well, the next year it's still cold. What do you do then, John?
Well, fortunately, we will still have seasons. We'll still have a growing season. It'll be shorter. The big benefit that we have is our modern technology, which, if you go back and look at the last event where we had thousands of people die and starve from the cold during the 1800s, they didn't have canned foods back then. We can do that now. We have power generation systems that can warm our house. We didn't have that back then. So we do have a lot of advantages. But the fundamental problem is once the crops start to fail, then we have to be able to adapt to those much lower crop production numbers that we're going to be seeing. So what does that mean? Well, it means you don't have to have a one-year food supply that you'll be totally dependent on for 1 year, but you may have to draw on it occasionally during some of those worst years. The problem I have, and my biggest concern, Rick, is we have so many people in our country now, something like 48 million, who are totally dependent on the government for food. And when you have that many people who have no capacity to buy their own food or to store food, what are they going to do when we start seeing the crop failures begin? That's my biggest concern, and the social disruption that comes with that. So the third thing I recommend is, unfortunately, if you go back and look at history, we had the same problems on a worse scale back then. People started looting, burning, rioting, killing their neighbors for food. We should expect some of that this time around. History does repeat.
What parts of the world would be the best place to ride this out?
Surprisingly, even during the major ice age events, which occur every 120,000, 110, 120,000 years, the tropics are usually untouched. The tropics will still be warm or hot. The problem we'll have is that the breadbasket of the world, the central U.S. and Canadian area, lies smack dab in the middle of what will be some of the coldest areas on the planet during either a Dalton or a Maunder minimum. You remember back then, we didn't have a Midwest breadbasket, just didn't exist. And now we have it, and the world's dependent on it, and that will be the bullseye of the target from the next cold climate standpoint.
So the rest of the world, even though they may have warm temperatures, they're not going to have American wheat and corn and beef and pork coming into them because of the disruptions to the food supply here.
Well, that's an excellent point. You're talking about the fact that those same grain crops are used to feed farm animals to produce meat and protein, and that's going to be the big ripple effect. It's going to be a challenge for many people to get off of their morning breakfast cereal or their sandwich bread or their McDonald's or Burger King hamburger when they realize there's simply not enough wheat to go around to make those things that we normally take for granted. And if you have an area where you have a lot of people who have no capacity for purchasing or storing food, then the food shelves will be bought out very quickly, if not cleaned out by rioting once this begins, and once we get into the worst years. So the third component of this is, unfortunately, we're going to have to learn from history, and history says you're going to have to be able to defend the food you have once you do have it.
Do you think the planners at the Pentagon and the analysts and the intelligence agencies are aware of these facts?
Yes, they are. I have personally made sure that every major agency head has been notified of this. I have spent the last 7 years notifying every governor in every state, every senator in every state, the leaders of our major Senate and House committees that deal with agriculture and science and climate and the environment. I have notified the mainstream media routinely every time we have a press release that goes out. And I've specifically made a point of working with some offices in the Department of Defense on this matter, knowing what it could mean, and trying to figure out how the government would react as well.
Mm-hmm. At what point do you think smart people who pay attention to these kinds of things, at what point are they going to start realizing there is a major change in the planet's climate underway, and we have got to make radical decisions? I'm talking about large home builders, agricultural corporations. At what point do they start to sit up and take notice?
Regrettably, even among home builders, much of everything is dictated by the federal government now. For example, I spoke with one major builder, and I said, we're going to need a lot more insulation for our homes over the next 4 decades because of the new cold era. And the response I got was rather disappointing and surprising. You would think an entrepreneur, a business person that runs a insulation company for home insulation, for example, would jump on this as an important issue and begin marketing so that people would buy more insulation to keep their house warmer during these record cold eras. But in fact, they actually follow government guidelines for minimum R ratings on insulation. So until the government tells them to put in R19 or more as a minimum standard in certain areas of house, they're not going to do so. And that applies to just about every other aspect in my working with the media, with financial industry, with the Department of Defense, with the Agriculture Department, with the major food conglomerates that produce and distribute most of our food. Just about everyone is following what the government tells them to do. And that is why we're on such a dangerous path right now.
Among your peers, say former scientists at NASA and other agencies, and let's say they're retired or in working for other employers now, are they privately talking with you and saying, John, you're onto something. This is troubling?
Short answer is yes. I've noticed over the last 7 years that I've been doing this that the discussion among the scientific community has gotten much more open and much more vociferous about this new cold climate threat, whereas previously hardly anyone wanted to discuss it. And a lot of people told me to be quiet, in fact, because it was a message no one wanted to hear back then. Bear in mind we had two presidential candidates, both of whom said global warming was caused by man and they were going to fix it. I mean, there was no one talking about the next cold era coming as I was doing back then. But now it's becoming more of a thing that people are willing to talk about, and with the four of the last 6 winters being very tough winters, and especially this one, people are finally saying, okay, we've had enough of this global warming theory. We know for sure that it's getting colder, not warmer. And but we've got 20 years of propaganda we're fighting against here. It's a challenge to get people to switch from global warming caused by man to global warming caused by the sun. It's a wholly different effort to get people to think about global cooling caused by the sun as the sun reduces its energy output. And that's still a message many people haven't heard.
Well, I encourage our audience to get a copy of John Casey's book, Cold Sun. You can read it in several hours. I stayed up one night till the late morning hours reading it. Couldn't put it down. I was fascinated by what I was reading in the book. The book, again, The Cold Sun. The author, John Casey, former NASA Space Shuttle engineer and White House Space Program advisor. John, thank you. Appreciate you being on True News.
Thank you, Rick.
You're listening to True News, the End Time Newscast. Rick will return after this announcement.
This is Max McLean. What warning does God give to those who trust in man rather than the Lord? Listen to the Bible from Jeremiah 17. This is what the Lord says. Cursed is the one who trusts in man, who depends on flesh for his strength, and whose heart turns away from the Lord. He will be like a bush in the wastelands. He will not see prosperity when it comes. He will dwell in the parched places of the desert, in a salt land where no one lives. But blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. He will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought and never fails to bear fruit. Jeremiah 17. Listen to the Bible. It's great for the soul.
You're listening to True News, your alternative source for global news, analysis, and commentary. I'm Rick Wiles. Bankster Ben Bernanke retired. And look at the mess the world is in ever since he left the Federal Reserve. Currencies in emerging markets from Argentina to Turkey are dropping fast around the world. The P word is showing up in mainstream media articles. Panic. The news media is also talking about a possible economic crash in China. The word on the street is that China's local governments have amassed over $3 trillion in debt. In Washington, Mr. O has his hand out again, begging for another $1 trillion or two in increased debt spending. Mr. Liu, the Treasury Secretary, said Washington will be broke again by the end of the month. In New York City, the state's top banking regulator has demanded documents from a dozen big banks, including Goldman Sachs, as the Department of Financial Services opens a probe into whether financial institutions manipulated currency markets. And in London, the UK's financial regulator, Martin Wheatley, told members of Parliament this week of his investigation into allegations of rigging at major benchmark rates in addition to LIBOR. And high-level bankers are falling off high-level buildings. 3 prominent banking officials and an auto manufacturing executive committed suicide last week. Things are just a mess ever since Ben Bernanke retired. What are we going to do? Well, how close are we to the implosion of the existing global financial architecture? How much time do we have to get ready? What practical steps can people take to lessen the collateral damage that will be caused by falling debris when the system crashes? James Turk and John Rubino have published a new book. It is titled The Money Bubble: What to Do Before It Pops. James Turk is the founder of Gold Money, a leading online gold trading company. Mr. Rubino is the director of DollarCollapse.com, one of the most popular financial websites on the internet. And John Rubino is on the telephone right now to tell us what you and I can do before the money bubble pops. John, welcome to True News.
Hey, Rick. It's good to speak with you.
Yes, sir. Well, John, things are just a mess ever since Ben Bernanke retired. What are we going to do?
Oh, we need him back, don't we?
Oh,
he had everything under control there for a while.
I don't know. I don't know if Janet Yellen will know what to do.
Yeah. Well, basically, you really can't put all of this at any one person's feet, because we've been making mistakes as a society since the 1980s, at least. We've been borrowing too much money. We've been printing enough new currency to cover our increasing debts, and each time there's a financial crisis, we hit it with even more easy money, and that makes the next crisis even bigger. So we've just been in a process of doing dumber and dumber things in order to fix the result of our previous dumb mistakes. And now I think, as you said, we're close to the end of the road here.
John, do you think that the powers that have made these major decisions along the way, going back to the 70s and 80s and early 90s, do you think that privately they knew what was going to happen? They knew that this would not work, that there would be a collapse? Are they that cynical that they did it anyhow, knowing that their decisions would lead to a financial Armageddon? Or were they just so proud they couldn't believe that their plans would not work?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And I'm not sure which I believe and which is scarier. But did they know what they were doing all along, and is what's happening part of a global master plan in which the top 1%, richest, most technologically savvy people, suck the wealth out of the rest of us, and then leave us in basically a dictatorship with nothing to do about it? Or are they so incompetent that they've been making these mistakes, actually thinking that they were doing the right thing, and have led us to basically the same point? So I don't know which of those is scarier. And I don't know which is true. Yeah.
Yeah, we're about to find out. I've often mentioned on this program the January 1988 front cover of The Economist magazine. The lead story says the coming global currency, and on the front cover of The Economist, I think, again, this was January 1988, there was a phoenix. And the phoenix was standing in a pile of burning paper currencies. It was the U.S. dollar, the yen, all these fiat currencies, and they were on fire. And around the phoenix neck was a a chain and a medallion, and it was a gold medallion, and it said the Phoenix. And if you look closely enough, it said 2018. And I've always suspected, John, that the banksters were telegraphing to those in the know, if those smart enough to pick up on the clues, that the currencies would implode in near the year 2018, and watch for the Phoenix to rise from the ashes and a new currency appear. That's always been my hunch on this. But man, this is getting scary, because this is 2014, and currencies are really shaky right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, 2018 is not an unreasonable date for when everything falls apart, because the numbers are getting unmanageable already. And so probably one reasonable scenario from here is that the emerging markets continue to implode, as you mentioned, and that begins to pull down the rest of the global financial system. And then the world's central banks respond with even easier money and even more debt monetization. And that possibly buys us a little more time, which takes us to maybe 2018, when the numbers are just so unmanageable that something has to happen. Either the global financial system collapses back into a 1930s-style depression, or we inflate away the value of all these major fiat currencies in the world, and then are forced, or by design, one or the other, we end up replacing those currencies with something else. And so the question is, what are they going to try next? Is it a currency like the SDR, which is basically backed by a basket of all the other fiat currencies, which would not really solve the problem, since the fiat currencies are what have no value? Or will we go back to something gold-based? There's a woman that, if you don't know her, you should meet her and interview her for your show sometime. Her name is Catherine Austin Fitz.
Oh, I know Catherine.
Yes, okay, sure. Good, because her theory is that that this is planned history, that these guys are operating with the goal in mind of sucking all the wealth out of the working people of the world, and then at the end, when they've used up these fiat currencies, they'll replace them with a gold-backed sound currency, sound form of money.
Called the Phoenix. That's what the Economist magazine was saying. It had a gold coin, 2018.
Yeah, because at that point, it's in the interest of the guys in charge to have sound money, because they will have accumulated all the wealth. And so they want to protect that wealth by having it exist in a system in which money is sound, and savings hold their value over long periods of time. So,
John, what about Bitcoin? What is this? For a while, I wasn't paying attention to Bitcoin because it just seemed so crazy. And then I started noticing high-level officials like Ben Bernanke. Bernanke said, remember his famous statement, he didn't understand gold, but he was fascinated by Bitcoin. And I thought, oh boy, let's pay attention to Bitcoin. Are they going to pull off a digital currency that they own, a privately owned currency?
The introduction of Bitcoin, or really the explosion of Bitcoin in the last year, is one of the big stories of recent financial history, because this is the first fully functional cyber currency that exists beyond national borders. It functions without any reference to dollars or euros or yen, and so in its early stage, at first glance, it looks like a force for freedom, because it breaks us free of these national currencies, which are the source of the power of the emerging police states that are out there now. But can it continue to function that way, or will it be co-opted or taken over in some other way by the national or global governments and become a force for coercion? Because once all our financial lives are completely online and don't have a physical reality anymore, they're open to being hijacked by the cyber war specialists in the National Security Agency or wherever. And once they've got our money, because it's all online, they've got control over us. So that's the question with Bitcoin. I just did an article on dollarcollapse.com titled "Bitcoin: Revolution or Trap?" And I think the jury's still out. It's not clear how this goes, but I think we need to be paying attention.
Absolutely.
But one thing that is undoubted about Bitcoin is that it functions well as a currency, but it's not money because it doesn't have a physical reality. It's not like gold and silver coins that you can hold in your hand and hold their value regardless of what other people do. Real money, like gold and silver, don't have counterparty risk. They don't require someone else to keep a promise for those metals to stay valuable over time. Something like Bitcoin, because it doesn't have a physical reality, requires the internet to continue to work. Your hard drive has to keep working, or if your Bitcoins are on your hard drive and the hard drive crashes, you lose them. The online service that you store your cyber currency with has to continue to function. Governments have to promise not to interfere with the payment system or hack your own computer and steal your Bitcoin. A lot of things have to happen for Bitcoins to hold their value. Mm-hmm. So they're a currency and not a money, and we need to differentiate between those two things when we're thinking about where to put our savings.
John, personally, I've always been against government deficit spending. Early, years ago when George Bush was president, I criticized him for his deficits and his war agenda. But W was spending hundreds of billions of dollars that we didn't have. And then along comes Barack Obama, and we go into the $1 trillion range. At some point in the reign of Barack Obama, things crossed the line into the insanity zone. And Mr. Obama has already burned through another $1 trillion and needs more monopoly money by the end of this month. It is so insane that I don't get upset about it anymore. At some point, I calmly made the decision to strap on my parachute because it's certain that this thing is going down. So what I want to talk to you about in the remaining minutes of this program, your book, The Money Bubble, what can we do to protect ourselves before this thing pops? Because I think it's a foregone conclusion. It's going to go down.
Well, we have to recognize that it doesn't matter who's in charge anymore. If the Republicans were in charge, the government would still be growing. The Democrats are in charge, and the military is still growing. So it doesn't matter what their campaign promises or what the planks in their political party's manifesto say anymore.
Same regime.
The system has its own moment. Yeah, it's all one big organization. Doesn't matter what party's in charge, and they seem hell bent on destroying the currency, among many other things. So we have to take care of our own individual situations and our own families right now. We've got to protect ourselves, and one way you do that is by lessening your dependence on the dollar. If we're a U.S. consumer and citizen, just don't have a lot of, for instance, bond funds or money market funds that require the dollar to hold its value to pay you a good investment return. And so you want to obviously load up on precious metals because those are forms of money that the government can't create in unlimited quantities. You want to diversify internationally if you have the capital to do it, because you never know which country is going to be the one to spin off into absolute chaos. And it could well be the U.S., so it's helpful to have some Latin American real estate or some precious metals stored in Singapore, or a Swiss insurance policy, or any of the number of other things that you can do to diversify yourself geographically. And then you need to be as self-sufficient as possible, because in the kind of world that's coming, where currencies don't work anymore and governments can't finance themselves the way they used to be able to, a lot of jobs are at risk, and yours might be one of them. So you want to have the lowest possible living expenses. You want to make yourself as indispensable as possible to your boss, in the hope that you're one of the guys who gets kept around when the rest of the system is falling apart. And you want to be able to do as many things for yourself as possible. So, this sounds like prepping, and I wouldn't go as far as, the whole doomsday prepper mindset, because I think in general in most parts of the country things will still work, but I think that they won't work as well as they do now, because we won't have the money to finance them. And so you need to be as self-sufficient as you possibly can be going forward.
I stress that people really need to be flexible. If you're rigid and trying to hold on to the old way of life because that was the good way of doing it, and we all are upset and angry and remorseful that that the American way of life that we've all known has ended. It's done. It's finished. But if you're rigid and you insist that you're going to continue operating and making the decisions like it was 1950, well, you're going to end up breaking, because you've got to bend, you've got to be flexible. And John, when I have listeners who say to me, "How in the world, Rick, am I going to get gold out of the country? I don't know what to do." For somebody who has a quantity of precious metals in this country, John, how give them some practical steps of how you can actually store gold in other countries and where it can be stored safely.
Well, there are services that specialize in that. And one of them is run and was founded by my co-author on this book, James Turk, and that's Gold Money. And they're not a bank. They don't lend anything out. They don't have any kind of derivatives or anything. They just store gold and silver for people. So basically, you open an account with them, you transfer some money to them, and you tell them what you want to buy and where you want them to store it, and that's that. They will open an account for you and store gold and silver in, say, Singapore for you. And then you've got some overseas in a place that isn't as subject to U.S. political pressure as, say, Switzerland has become, or London certainly is. And there are other companies that do a good job of exactly that, storing gold and silver for you. Mm-hmm. And if you've already got plenty of precious metals, you've got some of those stored overseas, you can look at real estate, which is another, it's much more complicated, but another good thing to own in other places.
That's right.
And a lot of people in the U.S. have some beachfront property in Mexico, or some condo in Costa Rica, or something like that gives them, first of all, a place to go if things really get crazy, and second of all, gives them a connection to another part of the world that, again, isn't as subject to the craziness of the developed world's coming currency crises.
That's right. And good old farmland.
Yeah.
Farmland is going to be very, very valuable, I mean, Jim Rogers, you've heard him many times. He said if he were young and starting over again, he'd be a farmer.
Yep. Yeah. And farmland has been booming lately. It's in you could almost call it a bubble if it wasn't for the fact that currencies are already a bubble, and that's why farmland's going up. But it's definitely booming.
That's right. And it's not that difficult to go into other nations in Central America, South America, and purchase land, whether, again, it's a house or a condo or just raw land. Once you know how the system works, it's feasible. You can do it. And so rather than having your money sit here in the United States in cash in Bank of America or Citibank, get some of that money and move it to some physical asset outside of the United States of America. And you won't have to worry about, if there's a crash here, you're going to lose every single thing you've got. What are some other steps that people can take that are very practical?
Well, you can, first of all, start to evolve your portfolio, the stocks and bonds that you own, towards hard assets that governments can't create in unlimited quantities, and away from financial assets, which they're rapidly destroying. So with your brokerage account, let's say you've got some stocks and bonds in your IRA or wherever. Well, you can sell your bank stocks and sell your treasury bonds and convert that cash into, for instance, gold and silver miners or other kinds of commodity-related companies like energy stocks or agricultural-related companies. And in that way, you're exposing yourself to the side of the economy that should do well in a big currency crisis, and minimizing your exposure to the parts of the economy like the big banks that you don't want any part of in what's coming.
John, for years we've told people that they can move their 401k, they can move their retirement program offshore and invest their retirement money in financial services outside of the country. They could buy land that their retirement program owns. And I've also warned people that at some point the U.S. government will be so broke that the government will take over the pensions and retirement programs of the American people and just suck those accounts absolutely dry. I wasn't shocked last week when Barack Obama gave his State of the Dictatorship address that he was going to introduce a government-backed retirement program. But, don't worry about it, because he said if you like your retirement program, you can keep your retirement program. But shouldn't people be concerned that Uncle Sam's going to be so hungry for cash that at some point they're going to start reaching in and taking that money?
Oh, without a doubt. In the money bubble, we give a list of past instances of this happening, beginning with the Roman Empire and going all the way through to FDR's confiscation of gold in the U.S. during the Depression. Governments that get too indebted and get desperate start looking around for other sources of revenue, and the financial assets and other kinds of assets of their citizens end up being prime targets. They will take your money away, and they'll impose capital controls which keep you from moving your money out of the country. So you need to address all this before it's too late, because once the capital controls go in place, you're stuck, and you're a sitting duck, and they will take what they want from you, and there's nothing you can do about it. And right now, it's 401ks and IRAs rather than gold and silver that are the low-hanging fruit, because the government knows where they all are, and it has the electronic means just to go in and do whatever it wants. It can convert 1/3 of your IRA to government bonds as a way of financing the government deficit. And
we've got the IMF talking about a 10% global tax.
Yes, wealth tax, where they go into your accounts and just take 10% off the top.
I mean, people, I've talked like this for years, saying, this is the kind of stuff, the robbery these people are going to do. And a lot of people thought I was just so far out. Now it's in black and white. They're actually talking about reaching in and taking 10% of everybody's bank accounts.
Yeah.
And it's still not news. They're like, wow, what else do they need to do to wake people up? 1 minute remaining. I'm not asking you to make a prediction, but you just your gut feeling. How much time do we have remaining?
I have absolutely no idea. My ability to forecast things in the short run is it's almost negative. You should do the opposite whatever kind of trade I put on. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. It could these emerging market things going on right now could be the catalyst that brings down the whole global financial system this year, or it could hang on for another 5 years of more and more debt and more derivatives until it finally blows up. So there's no way to know. But the important thing to understand is that it's coming, and the numbers are pretty clear, and we should be preparing now for that eventuality. And if we're a couple of years too early, so what? It really doesn't matter in the scheme of things.
That's right. Well, the book is The Money Bubble, What to Do Before It Pops. Co-authors James Turk and John Rubino. John, appreciate you being on True News.
Thanks, Rick. Enjoyed it.
Well, I didn't plan today's program to come together like this. John Casey talking about the cold sun, John Rubino talking about the money bubble, that when it pops. But I want to draw to your attention that Supreme Court Justice Scalia warned yesterday that internment camps will return someday. I believe the court justice issued a warning. He was sending a message to anybody who is paying attention. And the message he was sending is, heads up, a fascist dictatorship is underway. Internment camps, concentration camps are coming. Now you combine these two interviews, and again, I didn't have it planned this way. Climate change bringing about an ice age, which means social unrest, food shortages, riots, just a breakdown in society, and then the resulting financial system collapse. You put those two together, and now I think we have a better picture of why Homeland Security purchased 2 billion rounds of ammo. They know the climate is changing. They know there's going to be severe food shortages in the years ahead, and that's why they're making the preparation. I've got to go. I'll see you tomorrow. God bless. You're listening to True News.